Today I'm going to talk about the Bomber Command, Royal Air Force Bomber Command. And this is a very cursory look at it. Once I started reading about it and I told Brent I would do it, that was a mistake. Because just trying to read about the 8th Air Force, there's so much information, and that you're starting in 1942 and you're going to 1945. Well, Bomber Command, you're starting, actually 36, but you start in 1939 with the beginning of the war all the way till 1945, and there's just so much information on it. And then as I started reading about it, I was trying to figure out how to narrow it down so it could be a presentation where everybody doesn't nod off. And then I also realized that there's so many pilots in this group that there's no way I could talk about comparing the different airplanes. Plus, since I was a Navy officer, we never talked with our hands. So I wouldn't know how to do that if we're talking about all the different planes in the Bomber Command. So the Bomber Command's mission, and this is a statement from Churchill. Now, early on, Churchill had said, there's no way that we would ever start bombing cities. Now, if you remember from the 8th Air Force, the bombing philosophy that we had was that bombers are going to carry the day, and that with bombers, you can end the war. You wouldn't have to have an army to occupy the area. You would bomb the people, and then the country would surrender, and you'd be able to save a lot of the ground forces. And that was the philosophy. We had that philosophy, and the Brits had the philosophy. But you can read here what Churchill said: we have no continental army which can defeat the German military power. There's one thing that will bring them down, and that's absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by heavy bombers from this country upon the Nazi homeland. 1945, Churchill conveniently forgot that he ever made this statement. And then between 1940 and the invasion of Normandy, area bombing was the only way, besides isolated commander raids, that Britain could hit back against the Nazis. And some of the key dates. So 1936, Bomber Command is formed. When Bomber Command was formed, bomber pilots were the guys to be. Once the Battle of Britain starts, then everybody's in love with the fighter pilots, and then that same mystique kept going. September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declare war on Germany after their invasion of Poland. And by the way, Britain is the only country, the only belligerent in World War II that joined the war without being attacked. And if you think about that, they went to war because of what the Germans did to Poland. Once France and Britain declared war, FDR sent them a message and said, please don't use bombers to kill civilians. The Brits said, okay, we won't. The Germans said, okay, we won't either, except that the Poles were dastardly people and they attacked us, so we won't bomb civilians after we destroy Poland. The Brits followed on with that, and this has a lot to do with the casualty rates that the Brits suffered once they got into it. And the night of September 3rd was the first leaflet drop of the Brits started using, they thought it was psychological warfare, and they started running missions of dropping leaflets over German cities, like Hitler's a bad guy, you won't be able to win this. It didn't work. And then the night of September 3rd or 4th, the first attack on German shipping. And then they sent up a number of bombers, and the idea was that they would go after the German fleet in Wilhelmshaven and a couple of different ports that they could get to. And on May 10th, the first bombs on the German mainland. June 5th and 6th, the Germans bomb, as a result of the Germans bomb Britain. And then August 24th, 25th, the first German bombs on London. And then the next night was the first bombs on Berlin. But December 16th, 17th is the first major non-specific bomber attack. That's where early on, in 1939, they would try to hit German shipping, they would try to hit port facilities, submarine facilities, and one of the things that the Brits were doing was, because they had the agreement that they wouldn't hit civilian targets, if they thought there were civilians in the area, they would abort their missions, fly around, and come back in. And these guys were getting shot out of the sky at this time. And one of the other things that the for the British bomber pilots and British fighter pilots, they didn't have any work up to World War II. The Germans had been rotating their fighter pilots and their bomber pilots in through Spain for 3 years. They would rotate their Air Force in and out of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The Brits didn't have any warm-up to when they were starting this. August 18th, 1941, there's the Butt Report comes out. I'll go over that. November 41, conservation orders issued. That's the losses are so high, and the amount of aircraft getting shot out of the sky is so high that they issue a conservation report, which is basically don't send anybody out unless you're going to get some results. February 42, the area bombing directive is issued, and this was in writing. You are accordingly authorized to employ forces without restriction. Then February 20th, 41, Air Marshal Harris arrives. At the end of the war, Arthur Harris, he was called Butch Harris. At the end of the war, people, as everybody rewrites history, they started calling him Butcher Harris. He was not called Butcher Harris during the war. He was also called Bomber Harris. He comes in after the directive is issued. March 30th, 42, there's the dehousing paper. This is an interesting one, and that's a response to the Butt Report, and that's to keep resources coming into Bomber Command. You have the Army and the Navy fighting for resources in Britain, and Britain is strapped for money, strapped for natural resources. The Battle of the Atlantic is going on, and Bomber Command has to find a way to keep their bombers being built and money coming to them. So they come up with a dehousing paper. And then there's the Casablanca Directive in 41. That's actually 42, and that supersedes the area bombing directive. And if you remember the Casablanca Directive, that's where the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command got together and came up with a list of specific things, specific areas that they were going to attack. The Butt Report, as I mentioned earlier, the British were getting shot out of the sky. Early on, at the end of 39, they were having so many casualties on their day raids that they decided to switch to nighttime raids. The Butt Report came out, and if you look at that, it says only 1 in 3 that reported even getting to the target got within 5 miles of the target. And those are the guys that said we got there. On French ports, just to hit the port, only 2 of 3 bombers got within 5 miles of the target. Germany, 1 in 4. The Ruhr Valley, only 1 in 10 got within 5 miles of the target. Now these guys are getting shot out of the sky. Casualties are through the roof. On a full moon, 2 of the 5 got within 5 miles, and if it was a new moon, only 1 in 15 got within 5 miles of the target. And this was all done as a result for all the targets that they were hitting in June and July of 41. If you take a look at the picture of the bomb bay, you'll see up in the corner there's a camera. And that's what they would do, is when they dropped the bombs, they would then take pictures of what they were supposedly hitting. So all in all, only 1/3 of the aircraft claiming to reach the target actually got there. You can't make it up. If you read this stuff, it's very devastating. As I mentioned earlier, the first missions of the Bomber Command was German shipping. One of the first missions, 5 Blenheims, which is a bomber I'll show you in a second, they went after a German pocket battleship, Admiral Scheer, in Wilhelmshaven. They used dead reckoning and a watch. And believe it or not, the guy got there. They had no way to measure wind. The flying was so crude compared to what it becomes later on in the war. But anyway, the cloud cover was bad, so these guys flew 300 miles at 300 feet. I'm not a pilot, but I think that's pretty low. If you sneeze, you could be in the water. And they actually got to where the Scheer was anchored. There was no hits. They dropped their bomb. 2 bombs hit the Scheer. Nothing happened. They were duds. A couple went off in the water, and then they turned around and left. One plane, which was had anti-aircraft firing at it, turned off, and he went on to attack a German training ship named the Emden. This is the first casualty for the Royal Air Force in the war. And it goes after the training ship Emden, and then is basically a kamikaze attack because the witnesses said it just came in and went straight into the ship. The pilot's name was Harry Emden, if you can believe that. Very, very ironic. The other 4 Blenheims returned home. The same day, there was another 2 or 3 attacks using different bombers, and no results. They lost half the planes that went out that day, 16 of them out of 32 planes that went out. And then you'll see there between September 3rd and December 24th, 1939, they did 113 sorties against Germany, dropping propaganda. Hitler's a bad guy, you're not going to win. And the guys are getting shot down the whole time that they're doing this. One of the things a lot of the airplanes that the Brits had, at this time they didn't have, even though we had tried to sell it to them, self-sealing tanks. Self-sealing tank, if you took a bullet through the wing, the tank would seal and it wouldn't blow up. The planes that didn't have self-sealing tanks, if you put 1 or 2 rounds into the wing, which is where the fuel tanks are, it's gone. And this is one of the reasons that they're getting shot out of the sky. You'd have to go into all kinds of politics why both sides didn't listen to the different things that each side won. Here's another thing that I discovered. So now you're going to hit Germany. But in 1939 until the middle of 1940, Belgium and Holland are neutral countries, so you can't fly over them. So these bombers with very poor navigation, what you'd see, have to fly up into the North Sea and then come into Germany, or fly down, fly over France, and then come into Germany. So by the time they got there, they were low on fuel, exhausted, and they're trying to do it at night. You can't make it up. There's also no navigation on any of these airplanes. Almost all of it is dead reckoning. Then they started coming up with different aids to navigation, and the first one was G, which is radio navigation. It's originally developed to aid blind landing at night for airplanes, and it's 2 radio beams, and the max distance they could go out was 350 miles. So that's just barely into Germany. You can't hit Berlin. You can't get to a lot of the other areas. Then HS2 radar comes out. That's height to slope. It was an airborne ground scanning radar, and it allowed the planes to go further out than G. The first mission was January 43. And on the second mission, the next week, the Germans captured an intact H-2S radar set. And then a week later, they got a second H-2S radar set. So almost immediately, they were able to develop jamming products to stop them, to stop the Brits. They were amazed because the ground radar, the plane could be over and you could see exactly where you were. Oboe was another one, was radar tracking with radio transponder, where radar's tracking the airplane, and then they're talking, there's a ground operator using oboe to guide the bomber to get to its target. Now, all of these systems, you had to have people on the plane trained to use it, which is very difficult. The casualties were so high, by the time they trained somebody to use these things, chances were pretty good that they were shot down. They had about a 50% casualty rate in the first 2 years. 50%. You can't, it's insane looking at this stuff. One of the things that they did have that was pretty good, though, was they trained their pilots in non-warfare areas. So they were training in Canada, training in the United States, training in South Africa, and they were getting some pretty good training. But one of the other things that happened almost immediately that the British developed these different systems, the Germans almost immediately learned how to jam them or use countermeasures. Here's a couple of the early bombers. They were all underpowered and undergunned and had no navigation systems. Very few of them had any ways to get out of it. If you go to the museum, there's a bunch of videos that are running, and one of the videos I was listening to was a Bomber Command pilot. I'm not sure which plane he was on. I don't know if he mentioned it, but the only escape hatch was above the pilot's seat. Now, a lot of these bombers, they didn't have 2 pilots. They had a pilot, And then they also had a flight engineer who could, in an emergency, land the plane. But he helped with flaps, engines, things like that. So if you needed to escape from this plane, you had to climb on top of the bomber's seat and go out above him. Then you had to jump towards the propellers. This is in the manual. You had to jump to the propellers, and then you would go backwards and hope that you didn't hit the tail wing. I mean, this guy's talking about it, escaping from his airplane. And that was the only escape hatch on this one bomber. So climb up, intuition says, why would I jump that way? Well, if you jump to the tail, that would kill you. So you had to jump sideways to the propeller and then hope that the wind would take you down and out below the back wing, tail wing, whatever it's called. You can't make it up. Here's some of the other bombers. Now, most of this is just post-World War I technology. The Wellington was one of the huge workhorses of the Royal Air Force. And all of these, the amount of bombs that they could carry was minuscule to the risk that these people were taking. Here's their medium bombers, the Whitley, the Avro Manchester. The Avro Manchester was a bomber, and it had early engines on it. It was called the Vulture. And one of the problems with this is all these planes were tested, but none of them were, when they were purchased, none of them were tested with any bombs. So hindsight makes us all great, but it's like nobody put the bombs on these planes first before they tried to take them off. So you had these young pilots, just like us, 19, 20 years old. They're loading these planes up with bombs for the first time. Half of them can't do it. The harder the Manchester worked, the better chance you had of the engine exploding. You can't make it up. It's just, and it's just like our 8th Air Force. These guys every day got back up and did it again. So pardon? It was a poor engine design. It put so much stress on the engine. It was called a Rolls-Royce Vulture.
It dropped a piston?
I don't know. I'm Navy. That's why I'm not talking about the different planes, because I don't know. I'm just telling you what the history says and why they changed the engines and made a better bomber out of it. They also had a couple squadrons of B-17s, and if you look at these B-17s, you'll notice there's no belly turret on them. The British idea was that we don't need protection underneath. We're flying at night. We don't need the protection. We want to be able to take more bombs and go further. And you look at both of these planes. The Canadians also flew B-17s. Towards the end of 1941, the British Bomber Command got rid of the B-17s. They didn't have good luck with them. They were getting shot out of the sky. So they switched them to Coastal Command. Coastal Command was the unit that was in charge of going after the submarines and trying to win the Battle of the Atlantic. There was probably 30 or 40 B-17s in the 8th Air Force. Then in 1941, and then later in 1942, the Short Stirling and the Halifax came online. These were bombers that had a better design, supposedly, than the B-17 because they were later designs. They also had increased bomb load over the twin-engine bombers. Again, nobody has a belly turret. Then they came up with the Lancaster, and if you look at the Lancaster was basically a Manchester where they added these Rolls-Royce engines. So if you look at it, the engine's straight off, it's exactly what we put on the Mustangs. So it looks like 4 Mustangs stuck on the wing of these planes. The Lancaster was, again, I'm not a pilot, but you start reading all this different stuff about the different planes. The Lancaster was an incredible bomber. It had about 4 times the payload of a B-17. It flew with 7 men, not 12. It had 1 pilot and a flight engineer. And then the flight engineer could control the flaps, control the engines, and then he could also land the plane in an emergency. But again, none of these bombers had enough escape hatches. On the tail, if you take a look at the tail gunner, the tail gunner got into the tail, and then he had a door behind him, and he couldn't fit in there with a parachute on. So the parachute's behind this door. He's sitting in the turret, and if he got the message to bail out, which he usually didn't, if he got the message to bail out, he had to get up what he was leaning against, open the door, get his parachute, put his parachute on, then turn the turret all the way around and go out the door that he just got his parachute through. So now you try to imagine this is in a plane in distress, whatever the centrifugal force is, whatever's going on in the plane, that's if he got the message, and that's how he got out, just like if he got out. And just like the B-17s, which the tail gunners had the highest casualty rates, same thing with these guys. Our planes had escape hatches all over the place, and it was relatively easier to get out of an American bomber than any of the British bombers. This Lancaster also had a shorter turning radius than the Spitfire. And one of the reasons was the design was, however a plane works, as the jet wash or whatever it is coming over the propeller hit the tail is, the vertical stabilizers, it enabled the plane to turn easier than any other bomber. And what they would do if they were under attack, now try to imagine you're in the back, you have no clue what's going on. You're a waist gun or something like that. They would corkscrew. If they were under attack, the pilot would just slam it over and they would corkscrew down. Now, one of the things is they're not flying in formation. They're flying at night. They're in a bomber stream, so there's supposed to be there are other planes near you, but you have no idea where they are because it's dark. And so their way of escaping is just a corkscrew. So you wonder how many collisions there were. As you're flying along, the pilot decides to corkscrew the plane over and then go around and drop 8,000 or 10,000 feet before he'd try to escape. The Lancaster, like I said, about 4 times the bomb load of a B-17. These didn't come online until 1942, so the technology in the Lancaster was significantly better than the technology that was in the B-17. Here's a picture of the bomb load. The Lancaster, what you're seeing on the open bomb bay, is a 2,000-pound. Now remember, B-17 could only take 4,000 pounds approximately, depending on how much ammunition or how much fuel they took. So this is a 2,000-pound called a cookie, and then these other small brackets are incendiary bombs. So what they would do is they would drop the incendiary bombs. They would spread out all over the place. Then the cookie cutter would hit, and it would just light everything up. That's how they flattened Hamburg in a night, which was with the cookie cutters and incendiary bombs. You'd drop the incendiary bombs and you'd have little fires going everywhere else, and then the cookie cutter would come in and just ignite everything. They tried using it on Berlin, but Berlin had wider streets, different city designs, and it never really worked. They flattened Berlin, but it took quite a few missions to do it. You also look at the next one. That's a 20,000-pound bomb on the bottom of that Lancaster. They could modify the Lancasters to use any one of these bombs. So you see the biggest one is the Grand Slams, 22,000 pounds. Tall Boy, 12,000 pounds. 2 different designs for that. One of the 22,000-pound bombs that they dropped was the only bomb that semi-penetrated one of the submarine pens in France. There was 16 feet of concrete and a 22,000-pound bomb, and it just quite didn't do it. But you look at all these different bombs. So the Lancaster could be modified to take any of these different bombs for any of the different missions. The B-17, 500-pound, 1,000-pound, 250-pound, but that's about it. Not a lot of modifications. One of the protections here is a Lancaster dropping windows, or we know it as chaff. The Germans were using radar before the Brits were and before we were, and so we used chaff to try and jam their radar. And then you can also see the Lancaster with the smaller bombs. Those are 40-pound bombs, and then the cookie going after it. And then the Mosquito. The Mosquito is an all-wood airplane, probably one of the best airplanes that the Brits developed. And the guy was actually French. He tried to sell a wooden fighter to fighter command, also to bomber command. They thought he was nuts. Nobody wanted to talk to him. It took them a couple of years to get them to pay attention to him. Once they did pay attention to him, and they got this plane, it could do 400 miles an hour. So it could come in, take pictures, get out. It was one of the most successful planes of the war. They used it as a pathfinder. Remember I told you navigation was rudimentary, and they were trying to figure out how, if you could get to the city, you had to be able to get to the city. That was hard to do at night if everybody's turning the lights out. So they started using mosquitoes, and they would come in with different colored flares. They would light stuff up, because once the Germans figured out that they were using flares, then the Germans would put flares up over fields to try and get the bombers to bomb in the field. So it would be different colored flares each night. So the mosquitoes could come in and drop flares in a row so that the bombers in the bomber stream could head to the right area. And then this thing's all plywood. It's an incredible airplane. Here's the enemy. You can see, take a look at the anti-aircraft guns there, the searchlights, and then take a look at this picture. This is actually, this is not a German city. This is San Francisco or someplace on the East Coast of the United States that they lit up. But I just wanted to get, it was one of the few pictures that I could find that shows you what the spotlights could do and how powerful these things were. Now, another thing, none of those early bombers that I showed you got more than 20,000 feet. We were flying in 28, 29, 30,000 feet. So the British bombers were all significantly lower than us and a lot easier to hit. The Kammhuber line, and this is their night fighter air defense. The Brits had switched to night bombing. And you take a look at it, this was stolen by somebody in the Belgian underground and given to the Brits so they could figure it out. So this is all over occupied Europe. And then these sectors, you had a searchlight, radar, and associated night fighters. The night fighters would circle in the area until somebody was picked up on radar, and the ground controller could control up to 6 night fighters at a time. So they would vector the night fighters straight to the bombers. Harris, I'll tell you, he developed the bomber stream, and I'll tell you why that was important. Here's the only picture I could find, and this is what they called being coned. And this is if you were unlucky enough for the searchlights to catch you. Later on in the war, they had radar-controlled searchlights, and then you had radar-controlled guns. And these guys are coming in at night, and a lot of their planes were significantly slower than ours. And just like us, you had to stay in a straight line for a certain period of time to try and get your bombs to hit a specific area. And this is being coned. Here's the enemy, part 2. This is February 1944, and then this pilot is marking his 47th bomber that he's taken out. Now this is the same with us and against the Germans, but the Germans were shooting the 20 millimeter round. We were shooting 50 caliber out of all our bombers. All of the British bombers until the very end of the war were shooting a 30 caliber. You couldn't hit anything, and if you did hit it, it didn't do very much damage. The 50 caliber at least could take somebody out. The 20 millimeter, have a good day. And that's what the Germans were using. Here's their 3 main night fighters. These were all planes that had been used to bomb Great Britain. They were lousy bombers. The Brits shot them out of the sky. However, using them as night fighters, they were extremely deadly. And you can take a look at the different antennas on there, and that's how they could find them. Later on, towards the end of the war, the plane, some of these had a crew of 3. The plane could actually have the radar on it, and then he could find the different bombers. And just like with our planes coming over during the day, as soon as the planes got into the air, into their marshalling areas over the United Kingdom, the German radar could pick them up. And then all you had to do was just try and figure out where they went. And one of the sad things reading this stuff is reading that they were deciding to go after a city for a second night. It might not be the next night, but it would be shortly because weather was so horrible. So all the Germans would have to do is say, they came up here, they marshaled there, that was their turning point, and they're coming this way. Okay, they're coming to Hamburg. Oh, wait a minute, they're going to Berlin, they're going to Essen, they're going to Bremen. They were able to figure this out and then send up the night fighters to come after him. This is an interesting one. This is called the Scarecrow shell, and then it's called the Schrange music. Anyway, strange music or slanted music. And what this was in an ME-110 or a Dornier or a Ju-88, they mounted 2 or 4 20-millimeter cannons just behind, you can see it behind the pilot. And all they would do is they would come into the night fighter. Remember, the British said, we don't need anything underneath to protect us? So they had nothing there. So if the night fighter found the bomber, all he had to do was avoid the .30 caliber tail gunner, which was not hard to do, and he could just come under the bomber, just put 2 or 3 rounds into the wing, and blow the plane up. And then that's what they were doing. And it was called strange music. Now, one of the things about strange music is the Brits had no clue what was happening. These pilots would come back and they'd say, all we saw were these explosions all over the place. And then intelligence was telling them, well, it's called a scarecrow shell, and it's just to scare you, to get you to move off course or something like that. And they'd say, yeah, but it looked like fuel burning and we could see parts. And they said, no, no, no. Those are these scarecrow shells that they're sending up, and it's got a fuel component and a spare shrapnel component, and that's what's going off. And what they were doing was they were shooting the Lancasters out of the sky with these planes. They didn't find out about them till the end of the war, till after the war, that this is what they had when they captured a couple of these on some of the air bases. And the British pilots, when you read some of as the different historians are interviewing them, they still insisted that it was a scarecrow shell. There's no way that that's what they were doing. They would say, well, it looks so realistic, like a bomber blowing up. And it's because it was. Now, one of the things that flying at night, as I was mentioning earlier, talking with my hands, if you're on the 8th Air Force, you're in a bomber formation. So you can see everybody that above you, below you, and to the side of you. Night fighting, they just had a stream. You were supposed to stay at this altitude and fly to this point and then turn to this point. So you couldn't see anybody next to you. And so the Brits were suffering such horrendous losses, but the pilots didn't know it. All they saw were explosions, and then they would come back to their base. They didn't see that this guy got lost, that guy got lost, that these whole units were all shot down, because that's not how they flew. Everybody was on basically an individual mission. Prior to even having the bomber stream, the way their bomber missions worked was they would be given an area to hit, and then that pilot would figure out how he's going to get there. Is that any way to run a war? No. Bomber Harris changed that when he came in. But the scarecrow shell wasn't known, which it wasn't, was this actual plane. And you can see the painting where all he had to do was get under the wing, put a couple rounds in it, and then get out of the way, and the bomber would self-destruct. Arthur Harris, he comes in to take over the Bomber Command. And when he came in to take over Bomber Command, it was 8 days after the bombing directive had been given, which was basically go and destroy Germany. The first thing he decides to do is he comes up with the idea of a bomber stream. We're going to overwhelm the night fighters. So he plans a 1,000 plane raid. But then somebody has to tell him, but you only have 600 planes, of which only 350 can you put up at any one time. But he says he doesn't care. He wants a 1,000 plane raid. He begs, borrows, and steals bombers from everywhere in his command. Coastal Command says no, because they're trying to win the Battle of the Atlantic. This is 1942, and the Battle of the Atlantic is going, no one knows which way that's going to go. So he gathers flight instructors. They cancel all leave for anybody in Bomber Command. They call back guys who've already gotten their number of missions, who are out doing something else. They bring in anybody that's in training. They take pilots that don't have their wings yet, but they think, well, we think this guy can get the plane off the ground. If he gets off the ground and gets in the stream, we'll take him. So he gets up to about 1,047 bombers, and he puts the new guys in the center. Then they would take in some of these crews, the air crew, the gunners, navigators, had no clue what they were doing. But we're going to get 1,000 planes up. We're going to overwhelm the night fighters, and we're going to flatten Hamburg. Hamburg was socked in, so they went towards Cologne. Less than 300 of these planes were the new 4-engine bombers. The rest were those old post-World War I airplanes without self-sealing tanks. They'd already been shot out of the sky. And then here's the results. The bomber stream, instead of everybody trying to figure out how they're going to get there, the bomber stream was set up that you're going to fly at this altitude, you're at this altitude, you're at this altitude. Now, a couple of those bombers that went could not get the altitude that the Lancaster or some of the others could do it, so they were always down low. And remember the pictures from the 8th Air Force where you see the bombs right over the wings? All kinds of bombers were knocked out of the sky, because if they're flying in the stream and the people at the higher altitudes start dropping their bombs, because they didn't do it like we did it, where you watch the lead bomber, they were all supposed to figure out where they were. They start dropping the bombs and they start taking out the small bombers underneath. Like I said, the pilot trainees, excuse me, here, Ed, I need you to come here. You're going to Cologne tonight. But I only have 12 hours in a plane. I don't even know how to fly whatever you're sending, but that's what they did. They sent them up. They used diversionary tactics by fighter command to go after the night fighter bases. Didn't really work. But the results were 600 acres, and 300 acres in the city center were flattened. 328 factories taken out. Water, gas, electricity, telephone, and rail was knocked out, but only for 60 days. The Germans were able to build everything back within 2 months. They destroyed 12,840 buildings, 45,000 people were homeless, but only is not the right word, but only 69 civilian casualties. Operation Millennium, then that's where he got the name Bomber Harris, because then it hits the press, 1,000-plane raid, Bomber Harris this, Bomber Harris that. They didn't tell the people exactly what the results were. When they had sent the mission out, they sent them out, and the accepted losses were going to be 100 bombers. Try to figure out if you're in that decision-making process. They only lost 47 bombers, so it was a success. It wasn't really a success as far as the war effort goes, because the amount of damage was minimal. Now, the whole time during this, Bomber Harris is fighting for area bombing, city bombing. That's what he wants to do. If you remember, the Casablanca directive was there were specific targets that you're supposed to be hitting, and we're supposed to be hitting the same targets. And the idea was that it would be a combined bomber effort. Nothing could be further from the truth. We didn't tell them where we were going, and they didn't tell us where they were going. And so if you think about it logically, you'd say, well, if these guys hit Cologne at night, maybe we should hit it the next day and finish it off, or hit it the next week. That coordination very rarely happened. And Albert Speer, at the end of the war, that's one of the things that he said was, you guys, you would destroy something, we'd try to rebuild it, and then nobody would come for another month, as opposed to flatten it, hit it, flatten it, hit it, try to kill the people that are rebuilding it. Here's one interesting thing is Operation Chastise, which is the Dam Busters, if any of you remember that war movie. It's actually a pretty good mission. And if you look at the Lancaster, it's got that rolling bomb on it. There's a picture of him dropping the bomb. And they went through all kinds of testing for this, and this bomb had to spin backwards. This is a great drawing I found. So the bomber could figure out how high he was based on shining light on the water. Figure that out. He's got to spin the bomb backwards. He drops the bomb. The whole time they're getting shot at. They got to come in at a straight line because they need to hit the dam right in the center. The reason it's spinning is because they had multiple torpedo nets, so they couldn't drop torpedoes, and they couldn't get close enough to it to bomb it actually. So this spinning bomb would hit the water, it's rolling backwards, and it would bounce over the torpedo nets, hit the dam, then sink, and that at a predetermined depth would then blow up. They actually did blow up. The casualties were pretty high. They did knock out the two dams in the Ruhr Valley. You can see a picture there of the results of it. But again, the man who came up with this mission said we need to do follow-on. So as soon as they start trying to rebuild the dam and rebuild the hydroelectric plants, we need to hit them. At the end of the war, Albert Speer said, you guys never came back. So within 60 days, they were back up and running. They'd fixed the dam, and the hydroelectric plants were almost up to 100%. They never did a follow-on mission. But again, hindsight's everything. Because there is a lot of other stuff going on at the same time. There's a lot of other missions to talk about. When I was trying to do this, as I started to try to read, I'd read about the different aircraft. Then it was like, wait a minute, there's too many aircraft to try and compare. That would have to be another lecture. Then how do you compare the Lancaster to the B-17? How do you compare the different tactics? Can't do that. What are the great missions? Can't do that. And then one of the things that Arthur Harris was very strong-willed. He didn't follow the point-blank directive. He was going after whatever targets he thought he would go after. And it wasn't until when the run-up to D-Day, when they needed to destroy the German aircraft on the ground everywhere, Bomber Harris was basically forced, because Bomber Command was temporarily taken away from him, or at least command of the bombers, and given to Eisenhower and Air Marshal Tedder, because Bomber Harris still had the idea that bombers are going to win the war. We can bomb these guys into oblivion and then you'll surrender, and we don't need to put troops on the ground. That was still his mentality this whole time. So he was then ordered to start doing the missions to help with the invasion of Normandy. And then after that, he was basically, once he got command back, he was then forced again to go after the petroleum sites. He was still wanting to go after cities. But one thing that he didn't do, which he's blamed for in all the history books, is the bombing of Dresden. And if anybody knows anything about the bombing of Dresden, it was horrific. It was a horrible bombing. 60, 70,000 people were killed. Supposedly the city had no war value or anything like that, but it did. The Soviets, who were coming from the east, had asked and kept pleading that Bomber Command would go out and hit areas in front of the Soviet army, which is advancing. Now, our total losses, American losses in World War II, is about 419,000. Total Soviet soldiers is about 11 million. It's insane. You can't compare any of this stuff. So the Soviets are asking us to hit things. They asked Bomber Command to hit Dresden because they thought there was 2 armored divisions there. There was a rail center, and there was a bunch of other things that they thought needed to be hit. Arthur Harris said, we're not going to hit Dresden. We don't think that's stuff there. We need to hit some of the other manufacturing areas, because it's not in the bag yet. They don't know. They know they're going to win, but they're not sure how soon the end. I mean, the war just basically ended. They weren't sure. And Arthur Harris fought it and fought it and fought it. And Churchill said, I want you to hit Dresden. You're going to hit it. He made them put it in writing. They hit Dresden, flattened it. At the end of the war, the Russians came out and said, as people started looking at the destruction in Germany, the Russians came out and said, we never said anything. We didn't tell you to do that. What are you talking about? All you wanted to do was kill more civilians. And that's the story that went. And it wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed, when there was access to papers from the Soviet Union during the war, that a Russian Air Force or a Russian general had mentioned, yeah, we did. We asked you guys to hit Dresden. But Harris took the heat for it. Here's the Bomber Command Memorial. The Bomber Command, this is in London. What's interesting about this is at the end of the war, when Churchill's a great speaker, he gave his great speech and thanked all the different people and all the different units that had everything to do with ending the war. No mention of Bomber Command. All the major British generals and admirals were given peerage. I guess it means you call them sir, right? Not Harris. No, Harris now, because everything's changing and they're seeing these German cities that are flattened. Harris is now being called Butcher Harris. And he's being blamed for the flattening of these cities, even though that was his orders. The area bombing directive came out before he was assigned to Bomber Command. But that's all conveniently forgotten. Churchill threw him under the bus. Let me just get something here. Or not. One of the things about Harris, Bomber Harris, he had a Bentley sports car, and he'd have to drive between High Wycombe and the Air Ministry in London, and he was always hauling ass and getting stopped by the cops. And one of the police reported they'd stopped him, and the cop said to him, you might kill somebody, sir, going so fast. And his comment back, because the cop is the one that wrote this down, young man, I kill thousands of people every night. 1975, at an address at Sandhurst, which is British, basically the British West Point, he said that if Germany won, he would have been tried as a war criminal. That's basically the same thing that Curtis LeMay said after the firebombing in Japan. His dehousing campaign, there was a paper written, and remember, that was the way to keep resources coming to Bomber Command. The dehousing campaign, over 1/3 of all urban housing was destroyed. And the idea was that it's going to demoralize the population. It didn't work. And what's, again, hindsight, it didn't work when the Germans were trying to flatten the British cities. All they did was come together and work harder. We didn't use the same philosophy on the Germans. Yeah, Hitler's horrible. However, they're bombing us. So we're Germans. We're not, well, one, you don't have the capability to overthrow the government, but we're not going to give up. And we kept thinking that they would do what the Brits didn't do. And then I have one thing is, Churchill didn't mention Bomber Command in the victory speech. This memorial came about in 2012. And here's a good one. The money was raised and the interest was raised by Robin Gibb. Anybody know who that is? Yeah. From the Bee Gees. He was one, and then another British rock group named Jim Dooley from the Dooleys, which was another band. But they were instrumental in getting this built. The total losses for air crew. Now, what were the air crew for 8th Air Force? Approximately 26,000. Anybody venture a guess for Bomber Command? 55,573 air crew, of which 10,659 were Canadians. So a country that's 1/5 the size in population loses double. It's not trying to make a moral equivalence, but you just look at Bomber Command, and like I said, the fact that it was night bombing, people couldn't see what the losses were. Our guys could see what the losses were. Even if it wasn't the losses coming to your base, you could see the B-17s getting shot out of the sky. With Bomber Command, you didn't see anything. You flew, you saw some explosions. Intelligence told you that's a special shell. Those aren't bombers that are being knocked out of the sky. You can't make it up. And the air crew, the total losses, when you take people who died POW and training accidents, stuff like that, comes up to 73,741. Now, this memorial, Queen Elizabeth dedicated on her Silver Jubilee, I believe is her Silver Jubilee, but it says the memorial is dedicated to the 55,573 airmen from the United Kingdom, British Commonwealth, and Allied nations, of which there was quite a few Americans in there, who served in the RAF Bomber Command and lost their lives over the course of the Second World War. Now, on the other side of it, it says, the fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory. And that was a quote from Winston Churchill in 1940. He forgot that in 1945. Harris was not recognized until 1955. They offered him a peerage, and he said, no. He did he became a baronet. I'm not sure what that is. We don't have him here. He became a baronet. And then the memorial also says, this memorial commemorates those of all the nations who lost their lives in the bombing of 1939 to 1945. Now, the interesting part about this is you look at the bombers, it's a great sculpture, and then the top of it is open to the elements, and part of that roof is from a Lancaster bomber found in a swamp in the Netherlands. And when they pulled it up, the bodies were all still in the plane. This is 50 years after the war. They then took part of the wings to make this the roof on this memorial. So it's 2012 that it finally came into being. And if you look at if you read a lot of the history, you'll hear Butcher Harris. It was never called Butcher Harris. You see, he took the heat for it. And then same thing, everybody redoes it after the war, but those were his orders, and his orders were all in writing, and that was flatten the cities. And some of the statements he made, I have a good one here, just a second. I'm not technologically, I still can't figure it out, but there's a great, it's not here, a great saying where it's him sitting at a desk, and this is what he says. The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half of 100 other places, they put their rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. And those were his orders, and that's what he did. Any questions? Hope I didn't put you to sleep. But there's just so much stuff. Here's some of the sources and recommended reading. So Max Hastings is a great World War II historian. That book's 1975. Then Hardest Victory, this was written in 1995, and the man that wrote this, Dennis Richards, is a historian. He started out as a bomber pilot in Bomber Command, and then they figured out that he had a degree in history, so they put him into historical section for Bomber Command. And in 1995, he was sitting at whatever university he teaches at Britain, and he was listening to another professor there basically trashing Bomber Command, saying that these guys were murderers, basically stuff like that, which was revisionist history, and somebody that didn't know what they were talking about. So he decided to take it upon himself. This is a fantastic book, Hardest Victory. Men of Air, this was recommended to me by one of the docents at the 8th Air Force Museum, and this tracks British Bomber Command from January of 44 through to the end of the war. And then any of you know Len Dighton, he writes great books. And this is fiction, but it's called Bomber. And it's a great book, and it basically is 24 hours in your Bomber Command, Fighter Command, your German civilians underneath, you're part of the night fighters, and it's a great book. You can't put it down once you start reading it. But those are sources and recommended reading. There's quite a few other books that I use, but one of the problems is when you start doing this stuff, there's so much information to put out there, and I hope you got just enough to wet your whistle, and then maybe you'll start to read some of these things.